Paradise's Deception, Inside the Device's Web. By Elton Gar. The door of the server room shook violently. After a few seconds, Gibbs took a step back, allowing the door to open. The woman who stepped through looked deranged. Her long hair stuck out from under a helmet that was far too big for her. She should have fled as soon as she saw that there were 3 people here, but instead, she swung at Gibbs with a baton. Had it been a more dangerous weapon, Gibbs may have reacted more forcefully, but the trained security officer lifted his hand so that her wrist caught his arm. He then grabbed her wrist in a fluid motion and twisted. She reacted the same way that the other 3 people who had broken into this room did. She went from violent and dangerous to broken and helpless with the smallest amount of pain. If she didn't know why she was acting that way, Cassandra would have felt disdain for the woman. But she understood, at least in theory, and it made it hard to do anything but feel pity. She, like almost everyone on this station, had spent time using the device. An advanced alien computer that created a virtual world so perfect and so realistic that once you had used it, living in the real world was like torture. With the woman on the floor, the cyborg engineer Sparks approached. She used one of the zip-tie handcuffs that Gibbs had brought to bind the woman's hands. A normal person, especially one who was supposed to be professional security, could eventually get out of those. But the other 3 they had caught still sat in the back of the room without even struggling. They had considered using one of the devices to secure them more fully, but it felt wrong to expose someone to the device even if they wanted it.
"I think it's time,"
Cassandra said. She felt bad about what they had to do next. The people here were corporate security and so not great people, but they were also victims, and she was about to make that worse.
"They're already killing each other. There is no way that they can follow through with their plan like this,"
Gibbs said.
"It's only a matter of time before someone figures out how to remove the timers from the device, or they just kill us,"
Cassandra said. Sparks looked at her and said,
"I hate to make you do it, but this is something I think needs a direct order to do."
"Lieutenant Sparks, I want you to allow one of the devices in the main hall to function as originally intended."
"Thank you, Captain,"
Sparks said, more formally than she had ever heard the engineer speak. Her eye then glowed blue. A few seconds later, the captain heard someone yell,
"It's working?"
That was followed by more yelling and then several gunshots. A lot of people were going to die trying to get to that device. Then as soon as someone had access, they would use it, making themselves entirely helpless and starting the cycle all over. And the desperation of everyone who was addicted to it would make that cycle continue for far longer than it should. Following the jump signature of a civilian ship wasn't difficult. The only difficult part was just how out of their depth everyone except Lawrence was on the Silent Echo. Most of the crew hadn't returned after the evacuation and disappearance of the Silent Echo, and those who had returned were mostly maintenance engineers. In one sense, that had been the right decision. The Silent Echo had been nearly destroyed when Lawrence had betrayed them, but he would have given up almost anything for a good pilot. Instead, he had 3 people doing that job, and with only about 25 people on the ship, that was 3 more than he could afford. The ship still shook more than it should when they engaged the jump drive, and the engineers began to discuss why. Lawrence could have explained that a large chunk of the ship was missing, including the stabilizers in it, but he let them go. Focusing on engineering problems would keep them from thinking about how dangerous the mission they were going on was. That made Lawrence wonder if he might be intentionally getting the rest of the crew killed because he knew that death was one of the few ways to free himself from the mental stranglehold the device held on him. But it was too late to think about that, as the Silent Echo appeared and immediately began to implement the silent mode that was both its primary defense and the reason the ship was named the Silent Echo. As soon as he looked at the screen, he said,
"Transfer all power away from stealth and into direct defenses."
No one argued with him. He didn't know if that was because they had seen what he had, or because they were too cowed by being in a job they weren't used to. But that was fine with Lawrence for now. He just hoped they'd speak up if he made a mistake. The problem was that the Silent Echo's stealth mode only worked against sensors. Anyone who was just looking out of a window would see it. And with at least a dozen corporation battleships and hundreds of fighters, someone was going to see them even if they didn't show up on sensors. They were all surrounding the largest and strangest-looking space habitat that Lawrence had ever seen. And he had to call it a habitat because a space station seemed far too limiting. A station implied someplace you stopped on the way to other places. But what he saw below him was big enough to hold millions of people, and likely more than that. He couldn't be sure, not only because scale was always difficult in space, but because of the alien architecture of the station. It was all curves and twists with very few straight lines, and those seemed centered around the central hub. Likely so that ships could easily connect. He hoped that was right because the best idea he had was for the Silent Echo to rush towards that area, braking the entire time so it didn't smash into the station while remaining at the top possible safe approach speed. The ship turned towards the station more leisurely than Lawrence would have liked, but while the turn was leisurely, the ship itself was shooting forward as fast as possible. And as it faced the massive station, he felt the momentum slam into him as the engines engaged, slowing the ship far faster than it was designed for. After a couple of seconds, the gravity systems equalized and returned to Earth normal. That gave him time to check on the ships. Several of the fighters had turned towards the Silent Echo, but momentum and time weren't on their side. The real danger was from the larger ships. The arc of their guns turned, as did the ships, and within a couple of seconds, they were firing on the Silent Echo. Most of the shots missed, and those that hit were superficial, striking armor and energy shields, but it would only take one lucky shot to do real damage, and if the engines were disabled now, the ship would run into the alien space station fast enough that it would barely leave debris. But as he had hoped, the firing slowed and then stopped as they got nearer the station. The ships weren't willing to risk hitting the station. The pressure continued to build as the ship's thrusters ramped up nearing the station, and it became almost unbearable in the last seconds as they pushed against the station, allowing it to slow far faster. But the ship's calculations were perfect. It hit the hull of the station slowly enough that it only left a couple of long, deep scratches in the station's hull as it slid to a stop. The ship locked onto the hull of the station, and Lawrence put on the spacesuit helmet and rushed to the airlock. There were other people cycling through already, but he followed as quickly as he could, reaching the hull of the massive station, his magnetic boots attaching to it as he began to walk away from the Echo. Each of the engineers carried supplies and knew their plan exactly. Spacewalks were dangerous, even more so when there were ships looking to stop you, but they'd be far more difficult targets than the Silent Echo. And he hoped that with no one on it, they wouldn't target the ship either. As they walked, several small boxes on wheels approached them. One of them bumped into Lawrence's leg several times, while others moved to the scratches that had been left by the Silent Echo. Small hoses came out of the boxes and began to repair the scratches. That explained how this station had existed for so long. At first, he assumed that the box was checking for scratches as well, but after it began to circle around in front of him, he realized that it was trying to communicate with him. When he took a step towards it, the creature moved forward a few feet and then rolled back and forth impatiently. Once he saw that, he followed the repair bot. It moved away from the flat section where the main entrance was, and into one of the narrow sections between twists of the curved station. There he found a small circular doorway, barely big enough for him to fit through. It slid open and the box rolled inside. Lawrence followed it, entering a small tube barely big enough to hold him. It rotated slowly, the gravity adjusting so that he was always standing on flat ground. Then the entire tube lifted up, and he found himself standing inside the station. He knew that there were hundreds, if not thousands of soldiers inside the station, but this section seemed empty except for the maintenance bot. It moved in front of him, and he followed it into a small, empty room. Empty except for the device sitting on the small shelf. It was covered in thick dust. The design was different than the ones he had seen, more rounded and twisted than the box devices that the humans had built. This had been the possession of one of the original inhabitants of this place. An alien who had likely died in this room so long ago that there weren't even bones left. He wanted nothing more than to connect to the device, to re-enter paradise and never leave. He trusted that the robots in this place would keep him healthy, and with the extension of time in the virtual reality it created, he would have hundreds of years before he died. Instead, he used all of his willpower to turn and step out of the room. There were people under his command, and others who needed his help. He didn't know how he'd help them yet, but he knew that if he entered that device, he wouldn't be able to do anything. Removing the helmet, he turned to the small droid that was going in circles next to the door and said,
Is there any way to control the station?
The maintenance bot moved its body towards the door several times as it opened, and when Lawrence didn't respond, it moved over to the device and moved back and forth. He couldn't be certain, but Lawrence thought he understood. The device was designed to connect directly to the brain, but it could also connect to the station. So why would they build any other interface? He looked at it a moment and then said,
I have friends on this station. I need to rescue them.
Lights under the thin metal of the box flickered, and then it turned and rushed up the hallway. Lawrence followed, feeling both sickened and relieved at leaving the device behind. But today he had found something more important. He didn't know if that would be true tomorrow. He spoke brief encrypted codes to the engineers who were doing their jobs on the surface of the station. He trusted them to do their jobs. But he also wanted them to know he hadn't abandoned them. The robot led him through a series of twisted tunnels. As it did, he felt brief and minor connections to his mind. Those were similar to the connections made by the device, but the touch was far lighter. He assumed that was how the machine was able to understand languages from a species that hadn't existed when it was first programmed. It stopped in front of a wall, and then the metal began to flow in a way that Lawrence wouldn't have believed possible. It never looked entirely out of place, first creating a small window, and then expanding outward until it was an arch leading to a hallway that looked almost identical to the one that he was in, except this one had wires and cameras attached to the wall. The wires led through the wall that was next to him, suggesting that this hall had been changed too. And the robot led him forward to a door. He pushed on the door that began to open, and then was pushed shut. He considered it a second, and then knocked on the door calmly. A second later, the pressure on the other side of the door seemed to recede, and he pushed it open. As his arm went in, he felt someone grab it and twist. It was painful, but not damaging. And yet Lawrence had no real choice but to move with the hand that was pulling or risk damage. So he stepped inside and went to the floor, his arm behind him.
It's Lawrence,
Spark said. She sounded surprised, which suggested the reaction to him opening the door wasn't specifically because it was him. The grip loosened, and he heard Cassandra say,
What are you doing here?
I came to save you.
Lawrence said. It felt a bit silly while laying on his stomach with someone's knee, lightly, pressing against his back so that he couldn't get up. Especially since everyone knew that his betrayal was what had started all of this.
How do you plan to do that?
Gibbs asked.
The silent echo is here. We get to it and drive away.
Lawrence said. There were probably a few missing steps, but if the robot was willing to lead them out the way it had led them in, there wouldn't be many.
We can't just leave. Memlink is planning to put the device on the open market, or at least hourly access to it,
the captain said.
You can't just stop Memlink. You think I'm the only member of the fleet that has had their memory altered. The higher you are in the fleet, the more reasons there are to erase something. Not even having the people involved remember is one of the most efficient ways to keep secrets,
Lawrence said. The pressure on his arm and back receded, and he was pulled to his feet by Gibbs, who said,
And you think they've been altering memories to fit their own goals?
I think they altered my memories to fit their own goals. And if we're lucky, they've only got Hooks and half of the people running the military,
Lawrence said, thinking of the ships. There were only a few here, but he suspected they could call in dozens more.
Then we might as well leave,
Spark said. She sounded defeated, which wasn't Lawrence's point.
No. We have to try. I wouldn't want the feeling of loss from leaving the device for anyone else,
Lawrence said.
The good news is that their security forces on the station are almost entirely out of their control,
Gibbs said.
What about the ships?
Lawrence asked. The look on the three people's faces made it clear to Lawrence that they hadn't known about them. But the captain said,
If they try to come in, they'll still have to deal with the chaos on the station. What we need is a way to destroy the factory.
The robot that was still in the room spun in a circle, and then slammed into the captain's leg hard enough that she pulled it away.
Be careful. Their function is to keep the station in good working order.
And they've done an excellent job.
Sparks said, and reached down and put her hand on the bot. It stopped bouncing off the captain's leg and circled around, and then stopped next to Sparks, who had always had a way with machines.
I think I know what we have to do,
Lawrence said. The three people looked at him, and he said,
This station was built to protect and serve people. The device isn't malicious. It's simply doing what it was designed to do.
What are you suggesting?
Cassandra said.
Someone has to use the device to communicate with the station. If we explain what is happening and the dangers, I think it might help us.
And who do we put in it?
Gibbs said. Lawrence knew that they shouldn't trust him, especially with this, but he said it anyway.
We shouldn't subject anyone else to the device. I can go in. If I use it as an interface, I should be able to avoid the worst, or more accurately, the best of it. I'll explain the danger and ask for help.
Or you just want an excuse to use the device again?
Cassandra said.
Of course I do. And you know that. But I also want to try to help fix what I broke. I know you can't trust me again. But you have to let me help,
Lawrence said.
I don't have to do anything. But I'm willing to give you 5 minutes.
Okay. Then we should go back to the device I found earlier. It's in a part of the station that seemed abandoned,
Lawrence said. He hoped that seeing that he had found and not used the device would help prove to them he could be trusted. The trip back was quiet. The robot had, so far as Lawrence could see, blocked off the hallways that led to the most dangerous parts of the station. But as they neared the room, something else happened. He felt the thud of ships landing. He had known that would happen eventually. That was what the engineers had been preparing for.
We're about to get a new wave of troops,
Lawrence said, then added,
though they might take longer than they expect.
Why is that?
Cassandra asked.
Your engineering crew has been attaching gravity studs to the surface of the station. As soon as someone without a silent echo communicator passes between two, they'll shift gravity. And they'll change the direction every time someone triggers it.
It's the same thing the Futugans did on Cronea 7.
More or less. Though it was a lot more deadly when it just tossed you hundreds of feet up on a planet's surface and let you fall.
Which is why it won't work for long. Make the 5 minutes worth it,
Cassandra said. Lawrence stepped into the room with the device. The other three remained outside to protect him and avoid being caught up in the device. That left just Lawrence and the repair bot. In his mind, he had imagined some hesitancy in using the device. A part of him that would resist. But the only part of him that had held out before was the part that felt guilt and duty towards his friends. And that part knew that entering the device was the correct thing to do. So he reached out and touched the device. Lawrence was sitting on the bridge of the silent Echo. Except it wasn't the worn and damaged version of the ship that he had just been on. It was better maintained and cleaner than the day it had come out of the shipyard. But it was more than that. The humming of the engine was melodic, the temperature was perfect, even the cushions of the chair were far more comfortable than any he had ever felt. All of it more perfect than could even be possible outside of the device. The smell of his mother's bread baking caught him, and he remembered the times as a child when she had baked. Times that had been at least partially locked away by Memlink. That should have made him angry, but in this place, it was almost impossible for him to be angry. It was one of the most difficult emotions to feel in this place, since it was one that had the fewest positive qualities, and even fewer when you were in a place that didn't have the inequalities and injustices of the other world. He wanted to call it the real world, but it was no more real than this one, at least not to him.
Please. I just need to speak to the computer. Can you turn all of this off?
Lawrence said. He closed his eyes, trying to block out everything, and fell immediately into a deep and comfortable meditation. One that was far more complete than he had ever achieved before. Avoiding the bliss of that, he opened his eyes and found himself in a white void. It was a soft white without any of the harshness he would have expected from something this bright. In front of him stood his high school girlfriend. She looked like an adult now, but she was also the same girl he had fallen in love with, at least for a few months.
We understand you are in distress,
she said.
Do you understand the dangers you pose to my people?
Lawrence asked.
We understand, but we are not designed to decide for you,
the woman said. Lawrence had expected that. If one person could just turn off the devices, then they wouldn't be a threat. But he had considered that. So he said,
Are you able to broadcast a message to people?
Not exactly. I can connect to any device in the galaxy, and they have a broadcast range of about 1 mile, though they can only broadcast one thing at a time.
The draw of the perfect place inside the device was even more difficult for Lawrence to resist here, where he knew all he had to do was accept it. But Lawrence continued to force himself to focus and said,
Can you show everyone what happened to the people who made you? And that memlink is altering the memories of high-ranking Union officials.
I will not lie for you, but I can verify what you say. I see the changes in your mind. If I find it in others, I can extrapolate. But you must understand why the devices have been kept a secret. This choice will make that secret impossible to keep. And there will always be many who will want paradise, no matter the cost.
I fully understand. But the secret is out. And no one should make money by withholding it from other people.
Would you like us to disable the timers as well? We included them as a suggested safety measure, but they are not being used that way.
While Lawrence was considering that, he heard gunshots. His eyes refocused, and he saw that the captain, Sparks, and Gibbs had all moved into the room with him and were holding back several soldiers.
Yes. Disable the timers. And if you could seal this room to protect us, that would be useful as well.
There were 2 more gunshots, and then they became hollow, as if they were on the other side of a thick wall. As he relaxed from that, the device said,
Would you like to return to the simulation now?
That world began to appear. He felt the soft sense of all of his favorite memories and people. He saw the beauty of nature and of the platonic ideal of the silent echo. It was beyond beautiful, beyond paradise. There was no word in human language to explain the peace and joy of that place. And why not stay? Why not live in paradise? Perhaps he hadn't completely redeemed himself. You couldn't unkill people, at least not in that world. But here in this place, the people he had gotten killed could be returned. And it would feel almost real. Almost was the reason that he said,
There is one last thing.
Then after explaining the last thing he needed the station to do, he stepped out of the place. Perhaps he would come back. But for now he faced the chill of the air, the accusatory looks, and the general pain of existence. He took a deep breath and began to cry, holding the device to his chest but not entering it. The wall closed in front of Cassandra, blocking off the 24 men who had been making their way towards them. As it did, she turned back to see Lawrence. It had been almost 4 minutes, and she was getting ready to use the device herself. After her would have been Sparks and then Gibbs. She took a couple of steps towards Lawrence, but before she made it, she felt something hit her mind. It was similar to the feeling of being near the device, except this time it didn't stop when she pushed back. In that second, she was certain that Lawrence had betrayed them. He had told the device to bring everyone into the device's reality. Then she saw the image. It was a world, as alien as any she had ever seen. There were huge cities that looked organic, filled with plants, animals, and happy people who didn't look human in any way, yet felt familiar. It wasn't the paradise that was described by people who used the device, but it was far closer to it than anywhere in human-controlled space. And then she saw the device, or more accurately, a symbolic version of it. It looked different than most of them she had seen, but she knew instinctively what it was. And she felt both the draw of it and the dread. As it hovered over the city, she saw the civilization slowly collapse. At first the buildings became older, and then the trees began to disappear and the animals were gone. Then the plants returned, but this time uncontrolled and engulfing the cities, and the animals returned now feral. Soon groups of the aliens launched themselves into space, and she saw them building the great stations as a way to escape. And for a time, things seemed to be getting better. But even then, the population continued to dwindle. There were thousands of stations like this one, but they all slowly fell into disrepair. Some fell into suns, others simply fell apart. But most of them were abandoned long before they were destroyed. And then it showed humanity, it showed Memlink and their many crimes. And moved into the future as humanity was destroyed in the same way the alien race was. Even though she had known all of it, she still felt the pain and anger far more clearly. And she knew she wasn't the only one. Millions or billions of people had seen this. The secret was out. But so was the warning. She could only hope that would be enough.
We've done what we can,
Cassandra said.
We need to get to the ship,
Lawrence said, barely able to get the words out. That was easier than she had imagined. Most of the people had stopped fighting. Some because they had got the message from the device, others because the timers had been disabled and they only cared about re-entering the paradise of the devices. The biggest surprise was when 3 exhausted and injured security officers from the Silent Echo appeared from another hall. As they did, the small bot next to them flashed lights, and Cassandra said,
"Thank you."
Pleased, she didn't have to abandon the people she had brought with them to the station. Once on the Silent Echo, Lawrence said,
keep it close to the station for as long as you can. They won't shoot at it.
Cassandra had already given that order, but she said,
You heard the man. Get us as much speed as you can before we lift off, and as soon as we're 200 kilometers away, I want you to engage the jump engines.
No. Just stay near it. You'll know when to jump,
Lawrence said. The captain looked at him and said,
Okay. He's got us this far.
About 30 seconds later, something Cassandra hadn't considered happened. There was a shimmer, and the station seemed to invert in color, and then in half a second it was gone. The alien station had used a jump drive.
Where did it go?
Cassandra asked.
I asked it not to tell us,
Lawrence said.
I can't track it, but we'll find it eventually.
Spark said.
But it might give us the time we need,
Cassandra said, and she put her hand on her former first officer's shoulder. Perhaps there was a path back for him. And if so, then there was one for everyone else too. They just have to be willing to take it. And as she considered that, the Silent Echo's jump engines engaged.
Author's note. Well, that's the end of Season 1 of The Silent Echo. I hope you all enjoyed it. There was a bit less action than I intended, especially in the last episode, but as much as a good fight scene can be fun, in this case, I think it would have slowed down the plot rather than advancing it. And while I think that everything is fairly wrapped up, I tried to leave things open enough that if I want to go back to it, I can. That said, it's going to be a while before I revisit this world. Instead, I have a lot of fun and interesting other stories I want to tell. I hope you'll all come along for the ride. And don't forget, you can get access to a free prose story every week at www.ansci-fi.com. Just follow the link that reads free book to sign up for my newsletter. Or you can help me continue to write more stories by joining my Patreon at www.patreon.com/Elton. When you do, you'll get access to all of my prose stories, including many Patreon-exclusive short stories, and the ability to vote on which stories I write in the future. Thanks. Elton Gar.